Geez, I think the Q&A section just got a bit quieter. Thanks for that. But hey, thank you, Andy, and thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks, Rachel, so much for having me this morning. I'm just thrilled to be here. So for the last 10 years or so, it's been my absolute pleasure to work with businesses in about 15 or 16 different countries around the world, building very, very large-scale community investment, CSR, and sustainability platforms. And listening to all the numbers in Jack's presentation, every time I hear about the kind of pull power that sustainability and powerful corporate responsibility positionings can have for organizations in the community, the same question keeps coming up to my mind, which is why the hell are companies so bad at this? Like, if this is such a powerful thing, how is it the case that so many organizations can get purpose and positioning of purpose in the market so wrong? What I wanted to do in the very short amount of time I have today is really answer two questions, which is number one, why has purpose become such a powerful part of the competitive strategy for organizations? Because I think it's undeniable that we're seeing a shift, particularly in millennials and Gen Y, to consider purpose more centrally, and particularly consider a company's impact more centrally when they're making consumer purchases. I think the data overinflates how significant that trend is at the moment. I think really what the trend is people want purpose, but they're not willing to pay much for it at the checkout at the moment. Because when British Airways was the first company in the world to offer you the chance to offset your carbon footprint for £1, less than 1% of consumers said yes. So I think we want purpose and impact. We're just not willing to pay much for it yet. But I reckon that's changing and changing fast. So why is it that purpose has become and is continuing to become such a key thing from a competitive strategy standpoint? And I think some of the reasons for that and some of the subtler reasons for that really shape the second question that I'd love to answer, which is how can we do it better? Like, how can we bring purpose to life in organizations and tell the story of purpose and impact in a way that makes a meaningful difference to the performance of those organizations? And that's really the sort of two things that I wanted to take a crack at answering in the short time today. So firstly, on why purpose today in particular, why purpose today? So everyone would remember a few years ago, in New Zealand, there was a really interesting thing that happened in 2004 when GlaxoSmithKline were advertising that Ribena had twice the amount of vitamin C than orange juice. Does anyone remember that? Awesome. And it turns out that two 14-year-old girls with a Bunsen burner managed to completely derail that claim. It turns out not only does Ribena not have twice the vitamin C of orange juice, there's no vitamin C in Ribena whatsoever. It's like a million infinite % lie, right, from GlaxoSmithKline in this. Now, what's interesting about this story, right, is that in 2004, basically nothing happened off the back of this. So the two girls from Pakuranga High wrote a letter to the Advertising Standards Authority, and they got like an obligatory, nice, thanks for the note, but we've got like bigger fish to fry thing. Obviously, GSK said nothing in response. But then 2006 rolled around and something really interesting happened. The dawn of social media. And all of a sudden, it wasn't two 14-year-old girls at a high school chemistry fair that were arguing about this. All of a sudden, the story got picked up virally. And it turns out that people really, really care about Ribena. And all of a sudden, this new thing called YouTube was flooded with user-generated content featuring angry black currants mad at the company for... and if you're wondering what an angry black currant looks like, that's what an angry black currant looks like. I was asking the same question. And all of a sudden, the press that started surrounding the issue started making institutions like the ASFA sit up and take note. And all of a sudden, by the middle of 2006, a massive finding against GSK in the New Zealand Fair Trade kind of tribunal, multiple $100,000 worth of fines, and John Sayers, the then MD, putting an ad on television with him walking through like black currant vineyards, apologizing for their inadvertent misleading of the New Zealand population. Now, GSK are a good client of mine, so I say this with love in my heart. I was in Turkey about 2 months after this decision got passed down, working for GSK in their Middle East Africa office. This was global news. The Kenyans were furious. Turns out Ribena is like the national drink of Kenya. There'd been a national boycott in Kenya because of the misleading claims. Now, nothing in 2004, but a really significant outcome in 2006. And I would argue that's because what we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years is rapidly increasing transparency on the part of consumers, right? I think we now do business in public. And I think the finding passed down by Apple just a couple of hours ago is going to spiral massively more than it would have if there was no social media. I think the fact that A2 have just been taken to court in Australia because it turns out that all milk has A2 in it, not just A2 branded milk, is another example of rapidly rising transparency. And I don't think purpose has become important just because all of a sudden we woke up one day and got nice. I think purpose has become important because rapidly rising levels of transparency are leading to massively increasing levels of discernment amongst consumers. And if you want evidence for this, look at the level of discernment on science these days. This is a graph of the linear increase in the rate of published science and the exponential increase in retractions due to fraud and error in scientific journals. It's not just business being held to a higher standard. Peer-reviewed science in the age of open information is being held to a higher standard than ever before. So I think that ubiquitous transparency leads to a higher demand for authenticity. So I think that's one piece of the conversation. So let's just put authenticity here for a second, right? I think one of the bits driving the conversation about purpose is transparency and what that leads for authenticity. But I think there's another side to the conversation as well that has nothing whatsoever to do with good in the community. So we wrote a book at the start of this year. We've been writing for about 3 years. It was released at the start of this year, and it's called Matter: How to Become the Obvious Choice in the Hearts and Minds of Consumers. And we embedded in 15 different companies over the period of 3 years, going through massive organizational transformation. And a pattern began to emerge in why organizations were being disrupted so heavily across industries. So forget sustainability for 1 second. We're just talking about core business models of organizations being disrupted more than ever before. And if you want evidence for that, in 1940, the average age of a Fortune 200 company was about 50 years, and today the average age of a Fortune 200 company is about 5 years. So if you want an insight into the speed with which business models are being disrupted. And I would argue that the disruption we're feeling at the moment in most markets, separate to sustainability, is driving massive levels of substitutability and massive levels of commoditization in business. The more perceptive of you would have noticed from me saying lots of stats, I'm a super nerd, right? Like massive nerd, love a bit of research, and like all good nerds, I have a favorite graph. This is my favorite graph. And because I'm a nerd, I thought we could play a game that I'm going to call Nerd Jeopardy. I've left the label off the graph and thought it would be interesting to see if you look at this data, look at these data, nerd. And it is AUT, so you know, got to pluralize correctly. But look at these data and tell me, what question do you think may have been asked in order to generate these data? Does anyone want to take a stab at what it might have been? Michelle knows because she works for Carrigan's group. Yeah. So by the way, it's not, as was suggested to me about 8 weeks ago at an SAP conference in Melbourne with 1,000 IT managers. That was a fun presentation. It is not rock and roll through and through. It is not tax fraud, as was suggested. Some guy at the back just yells out tax fraud, which I thought was hilarious. Legally, no comment as to whether that's correct. However, so the question was, get a load of this, right? The question was, which of these organizations would you open a bank account with? So yeah, thanks, Andy. Fuck, was what Andy just said down the front. I think he gets excited and swears. No, wait, that was no. Sorry, a bank account. And not a bank is answer number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is not a bank on the list of who would you open a bank account with. Now, here's the interesting thing about these data, right? It's solid data, it's Young and Rubicam, it's paneled, they do all the right things to satisfy the quant experts. They asked 12 to 16-year-old kids who they would open a bank account with. For the next generation of people, the question is not which bank, the question is what's a bank? Banks are becoming substituted and commoditized not by their other competitors, they're becoming substituted and commoditized due to technology from a whole bunch of people that aren't even on their SWOT analysis. Industry to industry to industry, the same trends. Massively rising competition, massively rising commoditization, massively rising complexity, and massively falling levels of loyalty, right? Rising complexity, commoditization, and competition, and falling levels of loyalty, which leads to an environment where 73% of brands could disappear tomorrow and no one would care, right? No one would care. We wouldn't even notice. Life would just go on as usual. So what's a really worrying thing about this is take a look around the room and see if you can figure out whether it's you, the person next to you, or one of the two on the right side of you, right? Because that's what this piece of data says, right? This is what this datum says, right? Sorry, now we're just getting a little bit self-obsessed, but like this kind of plummeting levels of loyalty that come off the back of substitutability. And I think when you put those two things side by side, right, this kind of rising level of transparency that's driving a need for genuine and authentic communication, together with a competitive landscape that means it's harder and harder for customers to compete to win the hearts and minds of consumers, that's where you get the role of purpose in the middle of those two things. Because in a competitive, disrupted, commoditized world, it's not enough to be good, it's not enough to be great, we actually have to matter to people. We have to find a way of driving meaningful, unique, non-substitutable, non-commoditizable connections with people that build a value proposition that someone just can't come in and replicate for half the price by using labor in the developing world. We need to find meaningful, value-driven, purpose-driven value propositions for people in markets. And I reckon that's why all of a sudden it's not just the CSR people, but senior strategy people in organizations who are starting to take sustainability, CR, and community just as seriously as people in this room have taken it for a great many years beforehand, due to us kind of, I would say, being ahead of the curve in that regard. So I think that's why the competitive landscape drives people towards purpose more now than ever. But as I would say at the beginning, so we exist in the world to do two things, right? We have two beliefs, Carrigan's group, about the way this works. Number one, we believe that every dollar companies invest in the community should make a meaningful and measurable social impact. If we're going to do it, we should be able to see the results of the impact companies have. But number two, every dollar a company spends on CSR and community, we believe should create measurable value back to the business as well. But our argument is, most businesses don't do either of those things. Most of the money spent on sustainability, CR, and community investment doesn't create tangible impact on the community, and it doesn't create tangible impact for business. And I don't think that's because it can't. I deeply, personally believe that it can. We built an entire organization based on the belief that it can. But I think we need to do purpose better in most organizations if we're going to bring that value proposition to life. So after putting this together, sorry, I was going to do a whole bunch of data, but none of this is anywhere near as interesting as the data in Jacqueline's presentation. So let's just say that I had quant, and we're going to move on to another story. So I turned out putting my slides together, I realized this morning that I think the whole point of a golden rule is there's one of them, not five of them. But I'm going to have 5 golden rules, and we're going to argue about the semantics later on. Or not, if people would rather have a more interesting conversation. But 5 golden rules for how organizations can do purpose better and make sure we make maximum impact on the communities in which we operate, and extract maximum value back to the business for those things. So number one, I think the number one golden rule is don't be full of shit. Right? And I think that's really easy and natural to say, but that many, many organizations are, for want of a better scientific term, utterly full of shit when it comes to their sustainability and CSR practices. And I'm going to go back to Ribena for a second here, because we should have seen it coming with Ribena, because this is the company that launched an ad in the United Kingdom in 2001 that put bottles of Ribena as bristles on a toothbrush and said it's better than washing your teeth. It's like Ribena is better for your teeth than washing your teeth. So they had form in this regard, right? But I think the problem is that when it comes to the great spectrum of authentic communication, we go, there's truth or there's lies, and I actually think it's a lot subtler than that. I have a model for that, right? I call it the truthiness spectrum, right? And it looks like this: truth, positioning, spin, lie. Right? Truth, positioning, spin, lie. And my argument is that good advertising lives somewhere towards the truth end of positioning, right? A policy of universal truth leads to really unconstructive answers to questions like, does my bum look big in this, right? No one has an unabridged truth policy. It would be the most ridiculous thing from a constructiveness point of view to do. Positioning is just finding the right way to articulate messages that are true in the most tactful, responsible, and fun ways, right? And I would argue that organizations need to respect the truth and authenticity of things they're talking about, while not depriving themselves of the ability to position things in fun, useful, articulate, and compelling ways. But at its heart, we have to have truth at the foundation of what we're talking about, which links really closely to the second thing, which is I think organizations that do purpose well find a way to bridge the gap between values and behavior. I want to make a bold statement. I think organizational values are basically useless inside organizations. And my evidence for that is that respect, integrity, communication, and excellence, the RICE values, are the famous 4 values of Enron. Right? I think it's really, really easy to put values on a wall. I think the problem with values is if I ask this room who values their health, every hand would go up. But if I asked you to write down everything you've eaten, drunk, and probably smoked in the last 24 hours, we would look nothing like a room that values their health. I think organizations need standards, not values, for 2 reasons. Number 1, you can raise your standards, but you can't raise your values. Number 2 is that a standard is fixed. You either meet the standard or you don't. And organizations need to stop talking about lofty aspirational values and start talking about the standards of behavior that are the way of doing things. And they need to make them the highest authority in the business. And I'd cite Dr. Peter Fuda for the origin of both of those things, which is I think organizations need to put standards at the center of the way they operate. And that means from a sustainability perspective, sustainability isn't a value, it's not something we work towards. The way in which we do business has to become the standard. And the types of platforms we build from a community and sustainability point of view have to flow out from that. So exactly as Jacqueline said, it's got to be inside out, and they should be based on hardcore standards of behavior, not aspirational, lofty value statements. And I think so 1 and 2 kind of go hand in hand, I think. Number 3 is I would argue strongly that it has to link to business strategy. We did a really interesting piece of research last year, reached out to a few hundred organizations to ask about what they thought of the role of strategy in community investment and corporate responsibility. And unsurprisingly, 92% of organizations said that their business strategy was core to their decision-making in community investment. So when they were, this is community investment. So when they were deciding where to spend money in the community, 92% of organizations said that business strategy was a core part of that. And then you ask them, cool, can you maybe tell us what things you kind of rank and consider when you're deciding where to spend money in the community? And wow, I've just so many builds on this slide. It's going to be artful. And 50% said that that the key consideration was legacy and history, which is fundamentally non-strategic. If we're ranking what we used to do as a key consideration, that's not strategy. That's a continuation of the status quo. 53% said their biggest business challenges, and a kind of gratifying but not really 94% said key social issues. Now, it's not bad that organizations are considering key social issues making community investment, but when twice as many organizations say they focus on the community as focus on their own challenges, I would just argue that's not strategic. It's laudable and nice and good for the community, but it's not strategic. I would argue that unless the first question when we're designing sustainability platform is what are the most pressing and serious business challenges that we face and how does this platform address it, then it's just not strategic. And we need to equip ourselves with a language of business strategy if we want to move from where CSR is at the moment. Because I reckon this is one of the biggest challenges we face as an industry right now. In the 1980s and 90s, it was all about IT managers trying to get a seat at the executive table, wanting to shift from being seen as a cost center to being strategic for the business. And out of that emerged the role of the CIO and the CTO. In the 90s and 2000s, it was HR. We don't want to be seen as a compliance-driven cost center. We want to be seen as core to business strategy. And out of that emerged the head of HR. And I reckon sustainability is in exactly the same spot today. We don't want to be on a committee somewhere in the middle of the business. We don't want to be, reporting to someone who reports it. We want to be key at the decision-making table. We want it to be central to the organizational strategy. And to do that, we have to learn a fundamentally new language of business strategy. And at the center of it has to be why this drives business value, not why this does a good thing for the community. And I would argue we have way more community impact, and we can scale impact better when we prioritize the enterprise value that sustainability has back to the organization. So I would suggest this is one of the big challenges we face as a sector right now. The pig is 1 minute and 12 seconds away. I'm all over this. Seriously, I'm on it. I can do this in 1 minute and 7 seconds, especially if I stop talking about time. So rule number 4, measure impact. I'm not going to repeat any of it because luckily I'm just going to say what Jack said for measuring impact, although it is really interesting It is genuinely interesting, I think, that when you ask companies whether it's important, 90% say we should measure impact, but only 33% assess measurability when choosing where to spend their money. So I think we need to assess measurability before we put money anywhere. And finally, I think we need to tell really, really inspiring stories. So I'm going to close on this in 38 seconds. This is my favorite example of a CR-driven, like purpose-driven commercial success story. This is the jersey of Vitória FC Football Club in Brazil, a business that fell on very, very hard times and wanted to figure out if there was a way to put purpose at the center of its commercial strategy. So the black and red of this jersey are famous across Brazil, right? So one day, and it's Brazilian football, right? So people go nuts for this stuff. One day, the Vitória FC side runs out onto the pitch, and they've got no red in their jersey, right? So it's just an all black or an all white jersey, depending on whether it's home or away. So you can imagine there's 80,000 people in the stadium, right? And the Vitória FC club runs out onto the pitch, and there's no red left in the jersey. And so there's flares going off and there's a fight on the sidelines, but all of a sudden there's like silence, and people are like, what have you done to the jersey of our football club? And the teams line up and they stand up at the front. They do that before the start of games, like the teams stand up at the front. And Vitória FC, the players unfurl this banner. And the banner says, Vitória FC have given our blood for you. Now you give your blood for Brazil. Right, so it turns out that in Brazil, at any given moment in time, they're like 24 hours away from national crisis because of a lack of reserves of blood donation, right? So donating blood is this massive, critical, on-purpose issue for the state of Brazil. And Vitória FC had decided that if they could find a way to link their club to a purpose like that in a meaningful way, that would drive attendance, that would drive more people watching the game, that would create earned media. It was like a core thing for them. So they take the red out of their jersey, they stand up and they unfurl the banner, and it says, we've given our blood for you, now you give your blood for Brazil. And unbeknownst to people on that day, they'd launched a campaign that gained national traction, which was as people donated blood, they slowly put the red back in the Vitória FC jersey. They increased the national rate of blood donation by 46% off the back of this campaign. It was a $70,000 launch. They earned $8 million in earned media, and they massively increased attendances at games because they'd managed to find a way to link a credible, authentic, and genuine purpose right back to the heart of the business challenge that they were facing, which is how do we promote our brand and how do we get people emotionally connected back to the brand. I think it's a great example of putting purpose at the center of a commercial strategy that solved a business problem. So, thank you for holding the pig off. That was unreal. I'm like 2 minutes and 1 second over time. I thought we might get to see what the pig did, but okay. But thank you very much, and I hope to see everyone later.